All right. Well, thank you for joining us for NFIB's press conference in Colorado today. I'm NFIB Senior Grassroots Manager Jake Bronger. This press conference will cover the concerns that business owners have regarding Senate Bill 176, the Protecting Opportunities and Workers' Rights Bill, and HB 1232, the Standardized Health Benefit Plan Colorado Option Bill. Today, you will hear from Tony Galliardi, State Director of NFIB in Colorado. Rachel Beck, we believe, Vice President of Government Affairs for Colorado Springs Chamber, Diane Schwenke, President and CEO of the Grand Junction Area Chamber of Commerce, Gail Lindley, owner of Denver Bookbinding, and Roger Hayes, owner of Premier Employer Services, and Representative Hugh McKean as well. They will present here in just a moment and then take questions. So to kind of organize questions, all I ask is that you input your name and media outlet name into the chat. And during Q&A, I'll go ahead and call on you, and you can take yourself off mute and ask your questions. And you'll see that chat bubble icon towards the top right on your screen. With that, I'll now turn it over to NFIB State Director Tony Galliardi. Tony.
Thank you, Jake. Thank you very much, and thank you for our guests that have gotten on the call. And good morning to everybody out there in virtual land. Welcome to this press conference. The press conference is in direct response to the legislative attack on the Colorado small business community by the Democratic majority. The Democratic majority, instead of addressing pressing issues such as COVID liability protection for small businesses attempting to reopen and bring their employees back to work, or a $1 billion deficit in the state's unemployment trust fund, and several hundreds of millions of dollars of fraudulent unemployment payments. Instead, the majority party is currently pressing for passage of Senate Bill 176, known as the Power Act, rightly named for the power it gives employees over their employers for every slight or perceived harassment they may feel subjected to. In addition, the legislature is moving ahead to force a public option health insurance program on individuals and small businesses, ignoring that not too long ago, the citizens of Colorado turned down a government-run healthcare plan by over 79%. House Bill 1232 places full control of Colorado's healthcare insurance market in the hands of the insurance commissioner, a non-elected bureaucrat, with unchecked power to manipulate Colorado's health insurance market for both individuals and small businesses. And now I would like to introduce, and I noticed Representative McKean has joined us. If nobody minds, in respect for Representative McKean's time with the floor calendar, I'd like to go ahead and allow him to make his comments. Representative McKean, thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Tony, and I apologize if I'm jumping ahead of anybody. We got off the floor, and then we've got lots of committees that we've got to work on. But I wanted to be here today because I think that the biggest concern I have is that we just continue to see an erosion of the ability for employers to get about their business. And in fact, I think we've talked a lot about this, that what we are seeing is a tremendous number of hurdles placed in the way of business. And at a time when really we would like to see the state recovering from the last year rather than trying to have itself reinvented. And that's my worry, is that as we start to see bills like these, what we really see is that it's kind of the workers' paradise view of things, right? There's an action for any possible grievance, anything that formerly was really the relationship between an employer and an employee without the state being involved for the most part. And that's the concern I think many of us have, is that the time period for that symbiotic relationship between employers and employees has sort of gone by the wayside. And it seems like there's an injection of the state and government into every aspect of that relationship, so that it's more and more difficult for businesses to succeed. And then, of course, on the public option bill, what it really turns out is it's not an option at all. The bill that we've seen, albeit possibly changed by amendments, but we haven't seen those amendments offered yet. But the bill as we've seen it is not an option. It says to doctors and hospitals and insurance carriers, you do what we say, or you can leave the state. If you're a doctor, then you don't take the patients under that particular plan. Unlike Medicaid, where you could just go about your business and offer reduced rate services and come out from under the Medicaid group, now you'd lose your license. Hospitals would be fined up to $2.3 million over 90 days if they don't comply with the fee setting in that plan. And of course, the concern is that as we consume more of the market with government type programs, you end up well above 50%. About 65% of the market would, under this plan, including the small groups and the individual market, now it would be 65% of people would have some form of government health insurance. And that creates a very small pool for insurance companies and for the rest of us who get plans through our employers. So these are just some, and that's what the sad part is. These are just some of the bills that are making business much more difficult to conduct in the state.
Thank you very much, Representative McKean, and feel free to stay as long as your schedule allows. We love having you present.
I will, thanks.
Thank you. And next, I'd like to introduce Rachel Beck, Vice President of Governmental Affairs for the Colorado Springs Chamber of Commerce and the Economic Development Corporation. Rachel, thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Good morning. Thank you, Tony. You saw a special guest there, my cat. I won't duplicate what others have said. I'll just kind of tag on to what Representative McKean said, which is, a lot of times policymakers look at these sorts of policies in isolation. And one of the issues that the business community has right now is really the cumulative effect of a number of anti-business policies. Those costs add up, the administrative burdens add up, and if businesses are busy fulfilling those obligations, whether it's the paperwork or the additional costs, ultimately what that means is that it affects jobs. And right now, with unemployment high and Colorado really in need of jump-starting our economy again and putting people back to work, what we want businesses concentrated on is jobs and putting folks back to work. So I would emphasize to policymakers, please be talking to the businesses that are affected by these policies before they're proposed and keep that ultimate goal in mind. I think it's one that we all share.
Thank you very much, Rachel. And next, I'd like to introduce Diane Schwenke, President and CEO of the Grand Junction Chamber of Commerce. Diane, thanks again for joining us.
You bet. And thank you, Tony. Again, I don't want to repeat what's already been said, but we here on the Western Slope are seeing the effects. I think it's important to note that there's a statewide attack on businesses, and businesses are feeling that attack. I've had several of my small business members reach out to me and say, what the heck, I managed to survive all the economic woes of the pandemic, and now I face an even greater threat from my state legislature. In terms of, Senate Bill 176 is particularly scary to a lot of them, and we all want to see protections in the workplace from sexual harassment and from discrimination, but we do have those in place and let them work. We don't need additional burdens and things like what happens with independent contractors. And when it comes to the House Bill 1232, I like to point out to people that I'm sitting roughly 25 miles from the Utah border, and our fear here in Western Colorado is that we have a problem with access already to medical providers. A lot of our rural hospitals are in a fragile condition, and when it comes to primary care, you have a waiting time now. What happens if we lose even more of those prospective doctors in the future? So having the public option doesn't guarantee that you're going to get timely medical care. And again, I see our people going across the border. It's only 25 miles away, 20 minutes on the interstate. So we just see so many threats to our local economies, our small business communities, that when you take a look at some of our industry sectors that provide the most jobs, they are healthcare, they are oil and gas, and they are ag. And all of them currently are under attack with various propositions in either the legislature, the executive branch, or proposed ballot initiatives. And so our small business community, I think, can be summed up from one of our companies that was put an expansion on hold that would have meant 50 jobs in our community, and said, we're going to wait and see what happens in this legislative session. We do have facilities in other places, 3 other states, and maybe the expansion that was planned for Grand Junction, Colorado, doesn't happen in Colorado at all. So we are very fearful of what we're seeing currently in terms of how businesses are being just layer upon layer upon layer, to the point where we're not going to see the recovery that we hope for, and it'll be self-imposed.
Thank you for those comments, Diane. And moving on, I'd like to introduce Gail Lindley, owner of Denver Bookbinding, the last bookbindery in Colorado. Gail, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Tony. And I really appreciate that that you call on me a lot on some of these issues. And I think that's because we do have a history. Our company now is 92 years old, and we've seen it. I don't remember my grandfather ever complaining about the unemployment system. And what I have found in at least the past 40 years is that it's broken. So with the legislature, when they're bringing up all these different issues, I would just like to see them address one issue, and that's fixing what's broken right now. We have 3 unemployment claims, and they've already gotten benefit cards in the mail. Well, they never did lose their job, you know, and the system inherently favors the employee, and not the employer. So for an example, if we go to an unemployment hearing, if the employee does not show up, it is slated for another day. If the employer does not show up, then it's automatically given to the employee. This amendment, this 176, it just paints a really broad stroke, and it really penalizes the people who do follow the rules. So if we have somebody who, for the most part, brings in their personal life into the workplace, that's where it starts bringing in problems and feelings are hurt. Well, based upon 176, if I have an employee and their feelings are hurt, that could be grounds for being sued, because we're perceived as not being perhaps responsive, which isn't the case at all. We're responsive a lot. And, you know, we have a system in place where if somebody does have a grievance or a complaint, that they can come to us, but we document it very well, and hopefully.
Oh.
But this scares me, this 176. It really does, because legislation turns into money out of my pocket somehow, some way. It always has.
Thank you, Gail. And I notice you're starting to freeze up. So I think on your screen there, your camera is freezing up. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Roger Hayes, NFIB member and owner of Premier Employer Services. Roger?
Thank you, Tony. I appreciate you inviting me to this. There's been a lot already said. So what I wanted to focus on here really quickly was that in this legislation on the table, our legislature is really broadly redefining what harassment is. And I'm very, very afraid from an employer standpoint. We work with a lot of small employers to help them avoid and actually to create policies so that their workplaces are absent of any kind of harassment. But currently the definition is nowhere near as broad as what's being described in the legislation. to the point that the fear is, and it's a very palpable, true fear, that employees are going to really have it a lot easier if they want to muck things up and file lawsuits. Currently in Colorado, if you have an issue with your employer, you're able to take your complaint to the Civil Rights Commission. You can go to the EEOC, and then they'll go through the process to determine validity. And then if you so choose, you can file a lawsuit. But with this current legislation, you can skip all of that. There's really no leash, so to say, to prevent frivolous lawsuits from just running amok. And with all the other costs that employers have to incur currently, with all the other regulations and the rules, this is just really, I'll use the word ridiculous. It gets to be too much. None of us want to work in an environment where we aren't comfortable and we don't feel as if we want to go to that job, and nobody deserves to have to work in a place like that. But when you expand the definition of harassment to become so broad that somebody can file a lawsuit over hurt feelings, that gets to be a little bit onerous. And that's my biggest fear. And I wanted to focus on that today. So thank you, Tony. I appreciate you letting me have a piece here.
Thank you very much, Roger. And as just a final tidbit, personally, I believe Colorado is at a critical moment leading up to what promises to be a critical year for action by Colorado's small business community. And when I say action, it is imperative that we get our memberships and get small businesses ramped up in a year that requires decisive and strategic action. With that, I'm going to turn it back to Jake, who will open it up for questions.
Thank you. Yes, so just a reminder again, towards the top on your screen, members of the media, there should be what appears to be like a thought bubble. That is the chat function. If you just want to go ahead and enter your first name and the outlet you are with, I'll go ahead and call on you and you can unmute and ask your question to the team.
We have anyone out there with questions?
I see them. They're typing it in.
Okay.
All right. First up is Ed Seelover of the Denver Business Journal. Ed, go ahead with your question.
Oh, okay, thanks. So I'm wondering, when it comes to Senate Bill 176, you all have elucidated kind of your concerns with it. Are you looking for any amendments to the bill, or at this point is the bill such that you just want to see it killed?
I'll go ahead and go first and on that one. Ed, thanks for the question. You know, you and I have both been around those hallways many years. And Senate Bill 176 is one of those bills, I just don't know if it can be fixed. It goes so far and is so intrusive. It was really, if I look at 176, I see 2013 and House Bill 1136 all over again. A bill that put a target on every back of small business owners. So for NFIB, I just don't think the bill can be fixed at all. Rachel, Diane?
Hi, Ed. Yeah, I would agree. We'd like to see the bill killed entirely for a few reasons. One is we already have processes in place in both state and federal laws to protect people from harassment and discrimination. That includes the Colorado Civil Rights Commission, which is affordable for parties that are involved in mediation, and it's successful at resolving disputes more often than not. And the legislature just reinvested additional dollars in 2018 into that body. They also put another $650,000 into it as part of the budget process. And so we've really invested in that commission. And we at the Colorado Springs Chamber and EDC, and I'm guessing my colleagues would agree, would prefer to see these sorts of disputes resolved through the Colorado Civil Rights Commission, because it is a mediation process where the parties can talk to each other and oftentimes come to better understanding, which is really the goal, I think, of the sponsors, is they'd like to see some cultural change. And when we set up a process that is so litigious, that means not just costs for everyone involved, but I don't think that it really meets the goals of the sponsors. One of the details in the bill that we're really concerned about is that it creates these complaints, sets these up as statements of fact, which means if they go past the Colorado Civil Rights Commission, they have to go to a jury trial. And then, as Tony said, there's so many vague and poorly constructed definitions in the bill, which I can detail if you'd like. The language around employees, creating independent contractors, subcontractors, and even volunteers as employees under state law are hugely problematic. We're also creating a couple of new protected classes. Most of the things I just mentioned conflict with other state laws and federal laws. So we really believe that this bill is fatally flawed.
So, and if I can just jump on as well, I think Rachel pretty much laid out most of the things that I would have said. It's just that I find it interesting that there were 11 amendments proposed when the bill was brought up in committee. And yet when we looked at those 11 amendments, none of them were really very substantive in terms of addressing the issues of the business community. So, based on what we've seen so far and Rachel's great analysis, I would just say that from our perspective as well, there's only one place that we think this bill should land, and it may be round and circular.
Next up, we have Pat Poblete of Colorado Politics. Go ahead, Pat.
Thanks, guys. I have the same question about the public option bill. Is there any way that this bill can get worked onto a place where you guys are comfortable with it, or is this simply from your perspective, you want to see this one killed too?
Who would like to go first on this one? Well, Diane, did you want to jump in or?
Sure. I'll jump in. I'll start on this one. At this point in time, I would say, again, some of the biggest issues in the public option itself are just, whether you take the 20% reduction down to 15% or some of the other major elements, the bill sponsors have appeared to be relatively, unmoving in terms of wanting substantive changes. And again, we get to the issue of the public sector. Every time the public sector has meddled in our medical industries and medical access, we've seen so many unintended consequences. And so in the case of this bill in particular, the stakeholder outreach needs to happen. There needs to be a whole lot more dialogue. Again, this bill really, in my mind, at this point should be put aside. And I'm in one of those areas where we do have high cost. But we're coming around it as a community to try and work with our providers to develop some partnerships and other ways versus legislation to bring down costs. And this bill, at the end of the day, does nothing to bring down costs. It simply caps what's going to be paid. And so that's just not going to work.
Okay. Rachel, did you want to weigh in on that?
I'll just add to Diane's point, the Common Sense Institute, which is a nonpartisan economic research institute, has done some research on this topic. And if I can find the chat here, I'm going to put in the chat a link to their analysis that shows that healthcare costs have recent trends have resulted in lower costs and more choices in healthcare. And so our system is pretty competitive already, and this seems like another policy that is unnecessary. And some of its provisions are just so concerning the potential to cost shift, for example, to employer-provided healthcare. Just put this bill in the fatally flawed category as well.
Okay. I'll just a few just very quick comments is, you know, all the years that the healthcare issue has been brought up in the legislature, they concentrate on one thing: premiums, 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 premiums. I have yet to see this legislature address what's actually driving those premiums. We have physician facilities and drug costs. We have technologies and procedures. We have fragmented and uncoordinated care. It's interesting to note there was a study done just a few years back. Can anyone really guess where our highest expenditure of healthcare costs is? It's in Summit County. It's in Summit County. Multiple diagnosis and diagnostic treatments on the same patient. Readmissions are at some of the highest. Why? But nobody's asking. Nobody's digging. 1232, as I said earlier, puts the insurance commissioner. The insurance commissioner already has power to set rates. Last year, he rejected a 12.6% rate reduction by a carrier and only allowed him 5%. What do you think he's going to do if 1232 passes and the first time we roll around to start submitting rates under the new public option plan? What keeps him from just automatically rejecting those rates to get that 10% and 20% the following year? I agree with both my colleagues. The bill deserves to be in the oval container.
Next up is Brandon Thompson, Fox 21 News. Go ahead, Brandon.
Hello, thank you all so much for taking some time. Now, I understand the perspective that these both bills are kind of dead on arrival, but I kind of had a philosophical question for what they're trying to address, specifically with the public option bill. Just want to get your thoughts on how private insurance is kind of conducted through employers, and if you think that is fair to the employees in the restaurant industry, retail industry, that have to pay hundreds of dollars more for healthcare premiums because they don't have an employer that could provide them health insurance. And also some of the proponents of the public option say for rural communities like in Grand Junction, that this would add another competitor to the market to hopefully equate those costs. Just some philosophical questions for you to address some of what the proponents are saying about these bills.
So I'll jump in. With regard to the first question, here's what I potentially see happening is that with 1232, I think one of the unintended consequences, and Rachel addresses, would be cost shifting. At the end of the day, you've got to be able to cover cost in order to keep any facility open, and that includes medical facilities. So if you are capping the price that you get back under the public option, then in order to stay open and continue to operate, a family doctor is then going to actually increase the cost for any of those employer self-insurance plans. So we're going to see costs rise, and when they rise for those employers that are self-insured, some of those costs are going to get passed on to additional employees. So at the end of the day here, what I see are a couple of things in terms of if you're a restaurant employee and you're part-time and your employer is not required to provide insurance for you, you have the individual market that you can go to that they've been focused on for quite some time. And actually we've seen premiums come down. And then I think the other piece of this is that the conversations that I have in my community around, what we're looking at in terms of driving costs down, some of those things are actually happening, and they're happening at the community level. And sometimes those savings from those medical providers are actually not being passed on to those of us who are paying for the insurance. And so there's a lot of work, and it's a complex system. But layering on a public option that would, quote, be just more competition would actually just end up cost shifting for those of us in the private sector. So it's not going to do what they intend. Again, the bill sponsors, I think, are very well intended, but I just don't see it playing out that way in the medical field and in healthcare and in health insurance in Colorado.
Rachel, anything to add?
Yeah, thanks, Tony. Brandon, I would just add that there actually are a lot of employers that do offer those kinds of benefits to their employees, including some of the ski resorts and a lot of restaurants and other similar sorts of employers. And there are a lot of employees who are making choices that perhaps that's not what they want from their employer at that time. And, you know, I would go back to what Tony said, which is at the beginning, that a lot of times, you know, these are negotiations between employers and employees, and it's about having that freedom to be able to negotiate the priorities of both and come up with something that meets the needs of both employers and employees. And so one of our issues with the public option is that it takes away a lot of those options.
And just real quick, I don't see 1232 having any effect. Right now, the reinsurance program that was passed a few years ago has been shown to drastically reduce premiums. And it's achieving its intended goal. My suggestion would be to extend it, let it do what it's designed to do. The bill sponsor himself said, well, we're going to increase reimbursement rates because we were afraid that there would be no providers in the plan. We're going to give increased reimbursement rates by 150%. How do you increase reimbursement rates and lower costs? It's an impossibility. So I'll end there. Representative McKean, did you want to add to that?
You know, I think it's along those lines. It's, you know, the physicians in the Hippocratic Oath say, first do no harm. And of course, I think this bill does harm. I think it does harm right from the outset, because what it says is we will, instead of looking at the current landscape of where plans are offered, we will simply impose an unworkable solution. Then at the end of that solution, we'll just take over that part of the market. And I think that not only does harm, but what I mentioned in committee the other night is another saying of physicians that when they're getting ready to prescribe a new course of treatment, one of the very first things that they do is they take a thoughtful pause. And I think that this is that moment. We have no idea what medical care looks like in 2 years from now. We don't even know really what medical care is going to look like in the next 6 months as we recover from COVID and the number of ICU beds and the cost incurred by hospitals and doctors on their personal protective equipment side. All of those elements are changing in this moment. And so I think to completely recombinate the health care delivery system in the state, which is already 7th best in the entire country for both quality of care and total cost of care. I think that it's just you're doing harm and you're not taking that thoughtful pause. Let's get outside of this. Let's develop a plan to take a look at the right elements of this. And then, and only then, should you go forward. And if this bill were to be considered in its current form, it absolutely must come back to this legislature in 2 years. And we have to take a second look at what elements of it succeeded, what elements of it failed, what were the processes that went through. If the sponsors are not willing to do that, then it tells me that they're trying to ramrod a bureaucratic solution to a problem they may not understand.
Okay, I'd like to offer, I see Gail's back on, and Roger, do either of you have anything you want to add to this debate on 1232?
And I really apologize. I had a new computer and it died. But that being said, I was on the on the governor's mandated health care commission. And one of the really easy fixes was to have all the health insurance providers use the same form. That hasn't ever happened. And that was during Owens when I was on that commission. So are we overlooking the really simple stuff and making it like way complicated? In my opinion, we are.
Thank you. Roger? Anything?
Not to add, it would just be redundant, I think, at this point. I think you guys have done a great job at covering what the issues are.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Okay, Jake, next.
That appears to be all the questions in the chat. I do see we have a couple folks dialed in. If you'd like to ask a question, you can hit *6 and just let us know your name and the media outlet so that we can get to you as well. But if not, looks like that's all the questions, Tony.
Okay, well, not to hold up everybody and to be respectful of you all's time, Rachel, Diane, Gail, Roger, I want to thank you. Representative McKean, I can't thank you enough for basically dropping everything to join us. And we sincerely appreciate it. I think all of our organizations sincerely appreciate the effort. And with that, Jake, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, thank you all for joining us. If you have any additional questions, feel free to follow up with Tony Galliardi, and we will do our best to get an answer for you. Thanks for coming by.
Thank you. Thanks, Diane. Thanks, Rachel. Thanks, Gail. Thanks, Roger.
Thanks, everyone.